Hello viewers, welcome back to our YouTube channel. We want to proceed from where we had stopped. In the previous video, we had talked about the methods of collecting primary data, and right now we want to look at secondary data as one of the last types of data. Because we said the data can be categorized into discrete and continuous data, and then primary data and secondary data. So we had looked at the discrete, we had looked at the continuous, we had also looked at the primary data in the previous video that we have just completed. So what we are now focusing on is the secondary data. So what is secondary data? We need to understand definition wise. So secondary data, this is processed data. This is processed data. Processed data that have been already corrected, processed data that have been already collected and readily available. Collected and readily available. And readily available from other sources. From other sources. So this secondary data refers to the information that has already been collected by others. It could be maybe from government reports, it could be surveys, it could be maybe academic studies, it could be organizational records. Maybe you have gotten their financial statements and they have already prepared this information. So for us, what we only do, we just reanalyze it to answer the new questions or the new research questions that we have at play. So of course, this information, since it is already collected by others and it is readily available whenever we need it, to remodify it so that it can suit what we need it to achieve, then it means that that information is going to be cost effective, because we are going to save more costs. We are not going to look for this information for the first time. It is already collected, maybe it is in certain books. We just get it and try to solve the problem that we are trying to sort at the moment. It also saves time. It also provides access to a larger data set, because once you are using secondary data or data that is already researched, and you just pick any, maybe from books, you do cut out what we call the literature review. But one thing that we always have to put in mind is that we need to be very careful, and we need to be able to evaluate the reliability and relevancy of the information that we have picked, because you may get data that is not relevant to the topic under discussion. So secondary data is data that is collected by someone else for a different purpose, and then later reused by researcher to achieve their own aspects. So one of the sources we have talked about the different stuffs, maybe examples of where we can get this information. It could be maybe published research articles, it could be NGO reports, it could be school records, hospital statistics, maybe census, maybe from the UBOS, maybe it is a census data. Of course, if you get the information from the Uganda Bureau of Statistics, and maybe you're trying to look at the census data to study youth unemployment. So instead of you carrying out a new study, you just use the information that was already collected by other people. But as I said, for secondary data, we need to be very careful. We evaluate the reliability. So the question is, how do I know that this data is reliable? So let's maybe look at some small requirements that we must satisfy for secondary data to be reliable. Reliability requirements. So one of them, of course, we look at the relevancy of the data. So the data should satisfy the requirements of the problem under investigation. If you are carrying out research about maybe unemployment, the data that you have gathered should be able to satisfy the problem under investigation. So you should get all the information that can help you understand or draw a very substantial conclusion about the unemployment rate of maybe youths and others. So the concepts used must be the same and the data should not be outdated. Even the units of measurement must also be the same. So data for it to be relevant, so that we can rely on, it has to solve the problem under investigation. And for us to solve the problem under investigation, we must make sure that the same things that they used, the concept they used in capturing the other information should also be the same. The unit of measurement should also be the same. Because it will be hard for you to look at maybe unemployment rates. You are focusing on Uganda, but the unemployment rates were analyzed in US dollars. Of course, it will create, so even if you are to translate those values into a given existing market rate for the exchange rates, it will not make any sense, because it might give you values that are going to be higher or lower. So that's why we are saying everything, even the concepts that were used in that research or in that book, you should also use the same concept so that you can be able to draw the conclusion. That's what we are talking about, the relevancy of the data. Number 2, the accuracy. Accuracy of data. Of course, these are just the requirements that we need to, the requirements that must be satisfied so that we can say that this data is going to be reliable. So the accuracy of the data. In order to ensure how accurate the data is, we also have some requirements that we need to look at. for you to say that this information is actually accurate, we have to look at certain things. One of them, we have to look at the specifications and the methodology used. Specification, how specific is the data? Specification and methodology. Methodology used. Of course, these are the ones that are telling you that the data is accurate. Then the other one is what we call the margin of error. The margin of error. The margin of error should be examined. Should be examined. We shall talk about the margin of error and then the standard of error. Those are some of the things that we shall encounter when we go to confidential intervals and hypothesis stuff. Those are some of the things that we shall talk about from there. But for now, just to know that the margin of error, that is, just take it to be the error that is maybe associated within a given range. If maybe you are saying that the average, maybe the average age is, let's say, let's say 30. The average age is 30. But you are saying that this 30 maybe falls in a range of, let's say, 20 to 40. So there are some errors that may happen within here. Those are the errors that we are talking about. They should also be examined, because if we have so much, if more errors were committed in maybe capturing the data, we may have problems. The other is the dependency. All these are confirming the accuracy of the information. They are not confirming the reliability. The point that confirms the reliability is the accuracy of the data. These points, they confirm that data is accurate. And when the data is accurate, then it can confirm the reliability. It can be relied on to make decisions. It's like it can give you an assurance, a reasonable assurance. The dependability of the sources of the source must also be seen. The dependence of the sources. Can we depend on the sources where you collected the information? Of course, if we can, then it means the data you have collected can be accurate. So the other point that will affect the reliability is the availability of the data. Because we may say we have collected the data, but the data is not available. Availability of the data. So it has to be seen that the kind of data under investigation is available or not. You have to, maybe I have a book, I have a textbook where I'm getting that information from, so that we can confirm that actually we can rely on that information because it exists. So in case the data is not available, then in this case one uses the primary data. You leave the secondary data because it's not going to be reliable. Of course, the last one is the sufficiency. The data might be available, but it's not sufficient enough for you maybe to use it. So sufficiency of the data. Of course, the data has to be adequate and available. So the adequate data must be available for us to rely on that information, because the reliability of the information is very important, especially the secondary data, because it is the one that we are going to base on to make decisions by all the users. So that's why we are saying that the reliability of the information is very, very important. So let's now look at the advantages. Let's look at the advantages of secondary data. Advantages of secondary data. The first one that we can talk about is it's economical. That one we talked about it, it's economical. Something to be economical, it means it's either you are saving money or it brings in some money. So it is economical because it saves expenses and effort, since it can be obtained from other sources. So you are not going to spend a lot of time looking for information that you would have the time you would have spent if you were to use the primary sources to look for information. To capture the information yourself, you are going to save time, you are going to save money. So it's economical. The other point, it is also time saving. The other point, it's economical, we explained it in the sense that it saves expenses and effort, since we can obtain that information from other sources. But this one of time saving, it is more quickly to obtain the information than when we use the primary data. So it is more quick for us. We can quickly get this information from the secondary data, like books, publications, and all other maybe company documents or government reports. The other, it provides a basis for comparison. It provides a basis for comparison for the data that is collected by the researcher. If I have got my data, maybe I've done primary data collection and I've got my data from primary sources, I can compare that information with the information that I've gotten from the books to find out whether they are not diverging so much, or to find out how related the information might look like. So it provides a basis for comparison. It provides a basis for comparison for the data that is collected by the researcher. If the researcher has had always also done some primary data collection, then he can compare with what he has gotten from the secondary data to find out how the data is related. Of course, if you find that the data is actually the same, then it will tell you that that data is actually more reliable. The other, it helps to make the collection of primary data to be more specific, since with the help of secondary data, one is able to identify the gaps and inefficiencies so that the additional or the missing information may be collected. So you can use, remember we said that this information has to be sufficient. The secondary data, for it to be reliable, the information has to be, the data has to be sufficient. So if it is not sufficient or it is not adequate enough for us to make decisions, then it means what is pending is going to be the information that is missing, is the researcher is going to look for it through the primary sources. But because you have already gotten some information, secondary data helps you to know the missing information that you should look in using other methods. So it's an advantage because it helps you know the gaps that are missing in the data that you have so far collected. That's why you are seeing that most of the students do what we call research report. They do their proposal, then they go in the field to gather the information, depending on the case study where they have put, or depending on the case study they have put in their research topic. You always go and look for the information in the field. You write the research proposal, you use what we call secondary data in your literature review. You put all the methodologies, you put everything, but all this information, when you're writing a research proposal, that's why when you're writing a research proposal, they always write it in a future tense, because you have not yet gone to the field to get the actual information. Meaning all the information you have got, you have gathered it from either online, from publications, from different books, or from different authors. So we've said that it helps the collection of the primary data to become more specific and easy. So it helps to make collection of primary data to be more specific, because one is going to be able to identify the gaps and the inefficiencies so that the additional information or the missing information may be collected. So those are some of the advantages that we can think of. The other that we can talk about, maybe we talk about the disadvantages, then we also look at the sources of secondary data. So before we look at the sources, let's first have the demerits or the disadvantages. Disadvantages of secondary data. Number one is to do with accuracy of secondary data is not known. Accuracy of secondary data is not known. Secondary data is not known. Why is it not known? One thing that you need to understand is that when you find maybe someone has already published their book, it will be very hard for you to ask them where they got that information from. That where did you get the information you wrote? And most of the times, especially books that are not academic in nature, they may not show where they captured the information from. Because at least for these other books, they can put references, a page for references, so that you get to know where they got the information. So the actual essay may not be known. The other one is that data from which secondary data is obtained may be outdated. Data from which the secondary data is obtained may be outdated. Because just imagine you have gotten a book that was written in maybe 1995 or 1980 or 1900. You find that those documents, they have been there for so long. So some of those books, of course, sometimes the facts don't get outdated, but some of them get outdated. Because we can write about maybe a certain mountain, and with the passage of time, you find that the mountain is no longer there. Maybe it was swept away by erosion and other factors. So if you are reading a book that was written when the mountain is still there, of course you find yourself reading an outdated information. So the data where we have collected this information may be outdated, and it will give us a problem. The other is that secondary data may not fit in the framework of the research factors. Secondary data may not fit in the framework of the research factors. For example, I talked about the currency. You might be preparing research and you are picking information from a textbook that was written maybe within US dollars, and you are reporting in the Ugandan currency, the UJEX or the shillings. So you find that the unit of measurement are not tallying. So it means even if you transfer these amounts using an existing current exchange rate, it will not bring out the same exact value, that because those books were prepared some time back when maybe the exchange rates were lower. So some of the unit of measurements may not tally, and that will affect the quality of the information that we are collecting, or the reliability of the information. That's why within the reliability requirements, we said we need the information to be the same. Concepts that are used, even the unit of measurement should be the same. The last one that we can think of as maybe the disadvantages of secondary data is that users of such data may not have they may not have a thorough understanding of the background of the original investigator. So they may be unaware of the limitations. Because you see, if you don't actually know the person who maybe wrote the book, that's why you find books have different editions, that this is the first edition, second edition, third edition. But most of the times when they are making those editions, they always know that this was the problem, or this was something that the original author didn't work on. Maybe it is the same author, he knows the limitations that were there at the time when he was capturing that maybe first edition, and now they are making a second edition, just to incorporate in the fact of time, and also to incorporate in some of the things that were not available when the researcher made the research. So the users may not have a thorough understanding of the background of the original investigator, because they will be unaware of the limitations. So that's our last point. Let's now look at the sources. Where can we get this information? We talked about them, but we want to talk about them in details. Of secondary data. Where can we find this information? That's what we are going to discuss. One of the sources where we can get the secondary information, it could be government publications. Of course, for a Ugandan setting, that's what I'm going to put more emphasis on. For Ugandan setting, we can have, these are some of the entities where we can get the information. We can have UBOS, that is Uganda Bureau of Statistics. Of course, this one collects and compiles. It collects, compiles, and organizes statistical data on regular basis. That is Uganda Bureau of Statistics. It collects, compiles, organizes, and then publishes statistical data on a regular basis. Of course, some of the information that you can get from this, from UBOS, we can have information to do with maybe with the population growth, because they have done the census, population growth. We can also have information to do with death and birth rates. We can also have information to do with maybe trade journals, trade journals. And so many other information that can be done by government publications. So let's look at the other entity where we can get the information. The other entity, of course, we can have government autonomous bodies. These ones are different, and I'm going to explain why they are different. They are called government autonomous bodies. Government autonomous bodies. Of course, for these government autonomous bodies, what are they? These are like authorities, different government parastatals or entities. We can have maybe Uganda Revenue Authority, URA, Uganda Revenue Authority. We can have maybe UNEB, UNEB. UNEB, that is the Uganda National Examination Board. Of course, we can have like NADS. These are some of the entities that we can talk about. We can also talk about NEMA. Can also talk about NEMA, the one for environment management. We can also talk about maybe UCC, Uganda Communications Commission, the one that regulates the communication networks. Of course, there are very many entities. We can also talk about Bank of Uganda. So there are so many other organizations or authorities. So these ones, they provide detailed information on examination results, on tax matters, curriculum, agriculture, environment, and other aspects. So they collect and then they display statistical data on each of those different aspects. So that's the second. The third one, the third source, of course, we can have the international publications, international publications. Of course, now this is going to be done by international agencies. International agencies, they also publish reports on regular basis concerning issues of an international importance. So some of these, they can include agencies like IMF, International Monetary Fund, IMF, International Monetary Fund. We can also have ILO, that is the International Labor Organizations, International Labor Organization. We can also have maybe the one that deals with the weather conditions, the World Meteorology Association, WMO, World Meteorology Organization. So there are very many. We can also have things to do with maybe World Bank, then World Health Organizations. There are so many. Then we can also have UN, the United Nations. So those are some of the entities where we can get these publications, and they are authentic and reliable. So let's look at the other source. Those are three. The fourth one, we can have also private. We can have private publications. Private publications. Private publications. Of course, this one is going to be by private sectors, because also private sectors publish reports. For example, we can have maybe Uganda Securities Exchange. We can have things like NGO, non-government organizations. We can have USE, that is the Uganda Securities Exchange, and so many other private companies that publish information. Then, of course, the most common ones, we can have the newspapers and then the magazines. Newspapers and magazines. Newspapers and magazines. Newspaper and magazines. Of course, this one we have very many newspapers as well as magazines. They also display the statistical information on things to do with the maybe social and economical aspects of a given country. So some of these we can have, maybe we can mention but a few. Just we can have Vision, New Vision, can have New Vision, can maybe have Monitor, can have maybe Bukede, we can have the Observer, can have maybe even Red Paper. So those could be some of the newspapers. Then the magazine, of course, you can maybe put maybe Bridal Magazine. Bridal Magazine. So, of course, that is the most common source of information, but we also know that there are others where we can pick the information, can have different archives. Of course, this could be in terms of libraries, that have historical data of significance that is important. Of course, can have maybe different books by different authors. Then lastly, as a source of secondary data, we can talk about maybe the internet, because there is no way we can internets or websites. There are very many websites where you can get information, like the one, if you are looking for information related to finance, you can go to Investopedia. That's where you get information related to finance. So those are some of the things where we can get the secondary data. Now, having looked at the secondary data, we have also looked at the primary data. Now we want to understand what are some of the differences between primary data and then the secondary data. And once we are done looking at the differences between primary and secondary data, then we shall also look at quantitative and qualitative data before we jump to the variables, defining what variables are, and different other small aspects that we need to sort. So the differences between primary data, between primary and secondary secondary data. Maybe we can represent, we can draw maybe just a small ledger, just a T account, just to have this information. Maybe we can have primary data this side, maybe this side we have secondary data, just to highlight what we have talked about just briefly. Of course, we have said that data this side for primary data, it's original in nature. Original in nature. So it is original in nature, meaning it's going to be more reliable and more accurate. Original in nature, then this side data is not all that reliable. Is not reliable because it's not original. Because remember we said the secondary data, most of the times it is hard for us to even identify the original sources where the researchers got this information from. And most of the time is the data that is secondary can also be expired. We might have collected it from expired secondary sources. Then here, of course, the data is not easily accessible for the primary. Data is not easily accessible. Easily accessible. Of course, this side, the data can be easily accessed. Data is easily accessible. This side, primary data, is time consuming. Time consuming. So of course this side, it's not time consuming because it is easily accessible. Non time consuming. Then of course for the primary data, of course here we get detailed information. Here we get detailed information. Detailed information. Then this side the data may not be adequate. Data may not be adequate because you are using the information that was researched by someone else. You are not sure of what these people were researching about. So the information that they have was to sort the problem that they had at that time. That's why some of the information may be lacking within the secondary data. This side, most of the data is homogeneous. Data is homogeneous. Then this side, the data is heterogeneous. It's not the same. Because if you go in the field to look for the information, the data you will get will be the same. Here we don't need to put extra, no need to put extra precautionary measures. So those are some of the things that we can talk about as the differentiating aspects to do with primary data and then the secondary data. So want to look at the last category that we had not spoke about, the qualitative and then the quantitative data. Of course, this one, we are going to see that it may look somewhat similar to the discrete and the continuous, because I told you the other one, they are the major classifications. But if they are talking about the types, even when you give these two, it's not a problem. So we have what we call the qualitative, and quantitative data. But this one is very easy. So let's start with the quantitative. The quantitative data. Of course, as the word suggests, quantitative, this is just data that is all about the, it's all about the quantity or quantities. So it is going, when we are talking about the quantitative data, we are basically talking about all that information that can be quantified into, or it can be expressed into numerical terms. So as long as the data can be quantified, then we are talking about that as being a quantitative aspect. So when we talk about the quantitative data, this is information that can be, this is information about quantities. This is information about quantities. In other words, we are talking about information that can be measured, i.e., it can be measured and written down. Written down with numbers. So some examples of this, for example, Iggy can talk about the height, maybe your height, maybe your shoe size. We can talk about maybe the length. Can talk about the weight. We can talk about maybe the age. So as long as we can put figures, we can write it down as a figure, it falls under the quantitative aspect. For example, if let's say we are looking at, if maybe we are looking at students, maybe we have got a new student. Let's assume that we have got a new student in the school. If we want to describe this person using the qualitative aspect, we can maybe talk about, if let's say we have an intake, and the intake maybe we have gotten, let's assume the intake was 30,000 students. That is the intake. So the 30,000 itself, it's a quantitative aspect. The other way you can describe this data is that within the quantitative aspect, you can say that maybe within the 30,000 students, maybe we have 15, maybe 15, let's say 18,000, maybe they are girls, and maybe the balance of 12,000 they are boys, or they are men. The other aspect that we can also talk about this within the same 30,000 students, we can say maybe 55% of the students have paid their tuition. In full, or maybe 55% of the students are on bursaries. Maybe we can also say maybe the 20% of the students are private students. We can also go ahead to say that maybe 10,000 of the students are doing mathematics, or are doing economics, or they are doing accounting and finance. So all of that information that I have been talking about is quantitative in nature. So that's why we call it quantitative data. So let's now look at what we call the qualitative. Qualitative data. What is it all about? Now, for qualitative data, it gives you information, or this is information about qualities. The other one, it was about quantities. This one is about qualities, or information that cannot be measured. Information that cannot be measured. Information that cannot be measured. So some of the qualitative data we can talk about, of course, if you are looking at the examples, of qualitative data, we can say maybe we can talk about the color of someone's eyes. The other one that we can talk about maybe the gender of, let's say, the students. So what this entails, the qualitative data, it most of the times it deals with the description. It can tell you about the data that cannot be measured. It can tell you about the data that is all about maybe color, maybe textures, maybe smell, maybe taste, maybe appearance or beauty. But the other quantitative data talks about, it deals with the numbers, it deals with the data that can be measured, things to do with the length, height, weight, volume, temperature, speed, sales, sound levels, costs, members, age, and others. Maybe we try to use the same example to elaborate more on the differences. If you have to use the same example that we talked about of a new student in a school, what can we talk about that will tell that whatever we have described is actually qualitative? First of all, we can talk about if we enrolled, we can talk about that on maybe the August intake or the intake that we have made, we have gotten people who are friendly classmates. That would be a qualitative aspect. If we talk about maybe civic minded, that's also a qualitative aspect. We can talk about maybe we have got, maybe according to the students we have got maybe people who are environmentalists. They are environmentalists. They care about the environment. Maybe we have gotten people who have maybe a positive spirit, positive school spirit. They are more excited to maybe to join campus and have something new. Maybe we can talk about their color. Maybe you have gotten more, maybe majority of them are black. Majority are black. So those are some of the qualitative aspects, and those are the things how we can differentiate according to the data that we have received. So that's all that I wanted to talk about as far as the types of data are concerned. Now, the other key aspects that I need to talk about or to elaborate more on, there are things to do with maybe the level of measurement of data. Level of measurement of data. Level of measurement of data. The other aspect that I want us to also get an understanding of is an aspect to do with the differences between a variable and an attribute. A variable and an attribute. The other item that I want us also to pick an understanding in are to do with the sample framework or the sample frame. Then maybe we'll also talk about the response errors. Response errors. Because I want us, before we look at the computations or before we go into the things that are going to be computational, we first handle those different aspects. Of course, once we are done with this topic, the next topic that we shall start with will be all about sampling techniques, and we will be soon closing off the theoretical aspects that are that are very detailed as far as the quantitative techniques is concerned, but from the sampling theory, of course, we shall just talk about the non-probabilistic and then the probabilistic sampling techniques. Then we go into the measurement of data. From there, we shall be able to start some small computations that are easy for you to understand. So let's talk about some of the things that I've highlighted in the next video so that we can be able to finalize this chapter 2.